cooperative. You do things like the fast ferries or a stupid pipeline project to Vancouver Island, and it gave us lots to do. Then 1998 comes around and TransLink is created, and that again was kind of the mother lode in terms of giving opportunities to cover stuff. And in those days I got very interested in capital projects, because you had these things like the fast ferries, you had the pipeline to Vancouver Island, you had the Millennium Line, and more recently you have the convention center down on the waterfront there, which was a big boondoggle. And I stumbled across the work of a Danish planning professor named Bent Flivberg. And Bent Flivberg, I kept wondering, how come all these projects go way over budget? And it seems like people are lying when they come in with their estimates, and they're always way more expensive than basically corporations come in and loot the treasury, and it's quite a heist, and then that has impacts in other areas like education, healthcare. So anyway, so Ben Flivberg explained it all. They all lie, and they overestimate, or they underestimate, they lowball their estimates, and then that got me thinking more about kind of my job as being more of a kind of a sense maker, and how can I make sense of things. And one of the best things about working in the media is all the books that come across your desk, because I do believe sometimes, and especially if there are younger journalists in here, I really encourage you not to just read the papers or even the websites, but read these big, thorough nonfiction books, because they will give you the sense. So in some of the areas, so I've really focused on that. So in the area of climate change, like I don't know everything, and not even close, but I know people like Tim Flannery, Jeremy Leggett, Jim Hogan, who did an interesting book about the kind of climate change denial industry, George Monbiot. Christian Parente wrote a very interesting book recently about climate change, how it relates to kind of what's happening geopolitically. On the corporate side, I see Donald Gutstein in the audience. Donald wrote a fantastic book called Not a Conspiracy Theory, and it really helped me understand think tanks and kind of how the media and the corporate world and the think tanks all come together to kind of manufacture consent. Joel Bakken at UBC has done some fantastic work about corporations. His new book, Childhood Under Siege, his first book, The Corporation, he may have written others in between, but those are the two that I've read, and Naomi Klein, obviously, Loretta Napoleone. Psychology is another area. We've seen a lot of advances in kind of the understanding of the structure and function of the brain. So you get a guy like Gabor Mate, who's a doctor in Vancouver, who's just done some fabulous work in terms of elevating our understanding of addiction and the brain biochemistry. I have an interest in Jungian psychology and that, kind of how that may manifest itself. So when you pick up all this stuff and you learn about different areas and kind of try to become literate, then when something happens like the riot in Vancouver, I could say, okay, how am I going to look at this? What's going on inside the brains of these kids who kind of were scrambled and acting kind of irrationally, and there's a lynch mob mentality, and I feel like I'm able to do something that's different and maybe elevates people's understanding, and so you can kind of break through this media clutter and tell someone something they didn't know before. I think the Olympics was another example where you had people like Andrew Jennings or Helen Jefferson-Lesky at the University of Toronto. They do fantastic front-end work researching this. So then I come along, I see the Olympics, and I go, well, you know, I've learned from these other people who've spent way more time looking at this that it's basically a franchise operation. Vancouver's buying a franchise, we're taking all the risks. The IOC is head office, they're going to walk away with all the money. We may lose, we may win, but here are the issues here. So I think the same applies to culture. We live in a very diverse, you know, Vancouver's very different now than it was 20 or 30 years ago. Well, how do you become more culturally literate? I think on history, another book, Daniel Francis wrote a fantastic book called Seeing Reds, which was basically about the first Red Scare, which happened at kind of around World War I. But it really gave insights into some of the things that we saw in the post 9/11 happening in Canada. So one of the things I would encourage everyone in the room is you know, alternative media is great, and I think it adds a lot, but also let's not lose sight of these people like Donald here who are really knocking themselves out and putting together major works that really help us understand the world. And so I rely a lot on that. In terms of how my job has changed, probably about 85% of what I write now is just web only on Strait.com, not nearly as much in the paper. We basically have a daily operation where we're cranking out stuff all the time. I'm doing video. I worked in TV many years ago. I thought I'd escaped that, but now I haven't. I'm back in it, and Twitter and all of that. But I want to give you guys a chance to ask some questions, and let's hear from Karen. But thank you very much.
OpenFile relied on Karen Pynchon to start their Vancouver branch. OpenFile has rolled out across Canada with a new approach to journalism that is collaborative, hiring some talented young journalists to partner with readers to create the news collaboratively.
I come from a slightly different perspective, and I hope to bring some of that to the panel. Just to put things a little bit into context, is when I graduated into journalism, it's when the industry had already sort of hit a stage of crisis. And I think it's really important to recognize the damage that this has had on the industry as a whole. Instead of starting in a relatively gentle industry in the 60s as a copy boy, which I would have been a boy, I would not have been a woman, which maybe reflects some of the problems we're seeing now in terms of top management. But even if young reporters were in the top 2%, with unpaid internships and outlets that have been happy to run free content, the odds of actually making it were very slim. And I've sort of seen colleagues and peers sort of fall away through the years, and it's been pretty hard to watch. I believe that a new business model is possible, but we need to integrate sort of younger people into that process. To put this into a little bit of context, I got my start at the Canadian Press in Toronto, working both as an editor and a reporter, but also on their fledgling online desk. I moved here to Vancouver. I web edited and wrote for Maclean's, and then basically turned to freelancing because of the contracted media in Vancouver and how few opportunities they were to actually make a good living out here. I noticed, and not just in Vancouver, but across the country, there was the contracting newsrooms, people were being laid off, and the subsequent decline in quality, job security, and one thing I'd like to really talk about later maybe is mentorship. And it was clear that journalism needed a new model. After a few years of freelancing, about a year ago, about a year and a half maybe, I first caught wind of OpenFile and its business model on basically a call for freelancers on a Toronto listserv. And I looked at the business model and reached out to see how I could contribute. In my time working as the editor of OpenFile, I think I gave the spiel a million times, as a lot of the other people would understand, maybe particularly David and Linda. When something is new, people don't really recognize new things, and so you end up saying the same thing over and over. Basically, the idea is that readers, if you can fix this, I don't know. Thanks. The idea is that readers can open a file. So instead of taking news from the small bottleneck of reporters and editors, people in communities where news actually starts can actually flag things that were happening in their communities. So they could go to our website, sign up for an account, open a file. That file could then be distributed throughout social networks and sort of aggregate in a very sort of crowdsourced way. There's an editor in each city where OpenFile operates currently, and they are then responsible for flagging what should be reported, assigning the story to a freelancer. We're lucky in this case, Vancouver has lots of freelancers. See, technology, it always works eventually. That's another thing I've learned. So let's let the little moving dots tell you about it instead, shall we?
Why rely on other people to tell you what's important in your neighborhood? Who knows what's going on around you better than you? At OpenFile, you suggest a story, and we assign a professional reporter. Your story could be a simple question, a complaint not being heard, or something that the other news outlets consider just too small or unimportant. Well, we want to hear about it. So click on Open a File and send us your idea. Our editors post it to the site, and then you send it to people. They send it to more people. Everyone can comment, and add related video, links, or images. Together, we get a better understanding of the stories shaping our community. Then, OpenFile hires a journalist to work on your story and then publish it online. We report the news that's important to you, right where you live. And together, we can all help shape our stories, the ones that matter. OpenFile, it's community-powered news.
Thanks to all those tech people who helped. You don't need to clap. You don't need to clap. Basically, the site has only been online for about a year. So we just came out of beta, or our testing phase. As a lot of these sites have seen, numbers have been always on an upward trend. But I guess the one place in which OpenFile has a bit of an advantage is that we're still in this place of entrepreneurialism. We're still testing business models. We were lucky enough to have an angel investor. So we're still in this phase of having that pot of money where we can start trying things like, geolocated advertising, for example. So knowing where our readers are coming from, knowing what stories they're reading, and then figuring out ways of creating a more financially viable ecosystem within that metadata. Another thing is the idea that if you create reporters, get reporters, people who are professional writers to create content, that has a value. Anyways, I'm no longer the editor of OpenFile. I handed it off to a very capable man named David Godsall. But in some ways, I'm still following the OpenFile model. I saw that the future of freelance journalism, for young reporters in this room, I would absolutely encourage you to try it. Instead of, if things don't work out in mainstream, go to freelance, where you develop a specialty and then you write. Because I think, well, everyone tries to figure out a business model we're going to need to survive within the industry. I just wanted to highlight a few people who are doing journalism really well, to talk about ways we can go forward. I don't know how many people are familiar with Good Magazine. They're an example of how it pays to start with a lot of money, a ton of money, an extremely clear picture of your demographic, and a really talented web and infographic team. If you've ever been on their website, it's pretty astounding journalism. There's a New York Times subscription model. That's a good example of a place that's incorporated a lot of young, web-savvy, really talented journalists into their newsroom. And they have one of the very few newspaper subscriptions that I think is really worth value. I have it on my iPad, and I think in terms of a digital platform, it gives us some hope. There's ProPublica, but we've already got a really great description of that. If anyone here is really rich and wants to help start one in Canada, I'm sure we'd all support them. There's The Dependent. The editor of The Dependent, Matt Chambers, is here. They're a really great example, if you haven't seen them already, of a local organization that's trying to do really targeted investigative work, not wasting time on all the bibs and bobs that a lot of online news websites spend their time on, and really looking at funding and creating a sustainable business model for journalism. I'm just going to get to the conclusion, because obviously the interesting stuff is to be had in the conversation, but some of the things I think will help contribute to the future of journalism is more research into the business models, better mentorship, which, as a point of interest, when I was writing it on my iPad, it didn't recognize it as one word. It kept trying to bisect it into mentor and ship. Really, we need more of it, because in this every man for himself kind of industry, we're dying here, especially people who are younger. Collaborative projects, really taking some of this investigative work and splitting it up and maybe getting everyone on it. Maybe that's a way to do it. Better media literacy. That thing that David was talking about, having readers recognize value in content, that's the responsibility of the outlets to communicate that this has value, because we can't just take for granted that people will find it interesting. Hand-to-hand combat for reader attention on less sexy projects. So really making, and I think that can be done with good writing. Compelling delivery. I think freedom of information requests are important. Really, we need to spend less time talking about the future of journalism and more time doing it. And yeah, a few things also in terms of, I don't know if this applies to these indie newsrooms, but we need to get dead wood out of mainstream media newsrooms, because there are a lot of young reporters who want to do good work in the mainstream outlets, but the unions are in some ways restricting their ability to do so. I know this is not necessarily a friendly audience for that, but, and in some ways, keeping the technical platforms progressive while never allowing compromises of ethics and per-page click mob mentality. And that's about it. Let's get the conversation.